All right. So, in debate and in argumentation, there's generally a topic or a resolution that you're debating about. And so last week we did mini debate topics where the topic changed from debate to debate. In the online tournament, it'll be the same topic for the 2 weeks straight. All right. And the topic is resolved that this house believes that being a vegetarian is a better ethical choice than meat eating. The first question on the quiz is, what is the resolution? And you're expected to be able to write that word for word. Okay? So that's quiz question number 1. Is worth 10 points. Every word you get wrong is -1. So just memorize that sentence and you've got 10 points, which is like a 1/6 of the grade. There are 2 sides to each debate. Affirmative and negative, or sometimes what's known as proposition and opposition. And so the proposition is for this statement. So whoever's on the proposition side will say this house believes that being a vegetarian is a better ethical choice than meat eating, and the opposition has to say no to that. Alright? The reason why you need to know this word for word is because you can have sort of debates about what each one of these words could potentially mean. So, for instance, ethical choice. Ethics is generally understood as moral principles that govern behavior. So that way it's sort of more of a universal, like this should be in every instance because the rules that are set up in my head, the ethics that I follow means I should make these conclusions. Where a better moral choice, morals are generally defined as something that you learn in consequences of things, and so it becomes more individualistic. So what might be moral is not necessarily universally true, but ethics generally has a more universal applicability, which means that the proposition should be saying that it is universally true that it's a better choice to make ethically versus a moral choice, which is sort of more conditional. All right, and so that's like one example of the words within here being mattering. Saying vegetarian. Some people will include eating fish as still being vegetarian, which means that you might be able to get away with continuing to eat fish. And so you can actually debate about the various different words, which is why you have to know the resolution word for word. Okay? When the proposition says yes to a resolution, they normally don't just say, yes, I agree with it in the entirety, but actually sort of define what they want to defend specifically. So if it's a better ethical choice, how is it a better ethical choice? In what way is it a better ethical choice? And sort of pick the ground that you actually want to debate in. And so remember in the SPAR debates last week, I was like, it's about framing the debate, figuring out what it is that exactly you want to debate about. Do you want to debate about the environmental consequences from a utilitarian perspective of meat eating, or do you want to talk about the animal rights perspective on the proposition side? So you sort of defend the ground that you want to talk about in that regards. And there's social justice issues in terms of the way that meat eating links up with food deserts and the way that like illegal immigrants end up working in factory farms and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different aspects that you'd be able to take up there, and you sort of define the ground of why you think it is a better ethical choice. And the content of like what this debate will be will happen sort of like in I think next week or the week after. And on Blackboard, there's reading on both the proposition side and the opposition side if you want to get a chance to start looking over some theorists and evidence that take up both sides of like why it would be ethical, why it would be why it would be ethical to eat meat, why it would be ethical to be vegetarian. And so the proposition sort of picks the side they want to defend, and the opposition has to be ready to defend any of the various different variations that the proposition might say. Okay? In debate, there is a concept known as fiat. Quiz question is, what is fiat? Alright, fiat is a belief that if the judge votes for the proposition, that the statement is upheld or sort of goes into effect. So the opposition can't say, well, no one is going to choose to go vegetarian, or you'll never be able to force everyone to go vegetarian. Because the way the resolution is worded is about what the House should believe, and the House could be like a governmental body, or it could be a group of people, but it's a belief structure. So if the judge votes for the proposition, the end result is that the judge is upholding that value statement. So the negative can't say, universally people won't accept that value statement, because debate's supposed to be about what should be done, or what we should believe, and not necessarily what can be done or what can we believe. Alright, so fiat is a belief that if the judge votes affirmative, for the proposition, that the value statement is affirmed, goes into effect, is upheld, and so that just prevents the opposition from being able to say things like it's just theoretically impossible. Does that make sense to people? All right. And now, if the proposition upholds that it's a better ethical choice, the proposition might also be responsible for defending everyone also then starting to become vegetarian and the consequential effects that it might have on the economy in terms of like farmers and especially local farmers, the way that different politics might shift around and things like that. So the proposition is still responsible for the effects of that value statement being affirmed though. Okay, so there's a distinction between like what's possible and then what is going to be affirmed as a result. Does that make sense to people? Okay. So the next thing you need to know is the order of the speeches. The first speech is the proposition opening, and that's 4 minutes long. Then it's the opposition opening, and that's 5 minutes long. Then the proposition's rebuttal, which is 3 minutes long. The opposition's rebuttal and closing, which is 4 minutes long, and then the proposition's closing, which is 2 minutes long. So you're supposed to be able to write the order of those speeches and the time length of those speeches on the quiz next week. Okay? And so what it literally means is that when you are the proposition opening, you will record a 4-minute speech. Alright? When you get to 4 minutes, it's expected that you would stop speaking. You could get to like the logical finishing point, so if it's like 4 minutes and 2 seconds, that's fine. If you turn your camera on and there's like 5 seconds before you start speaking, you could go like 5 seconds over, but you're supposed to stop at 4 minutes. Okay? Yeah?
Is it live or is it like something you pre-recorded?
Nope. You'll pre-record it, and the way it works, and we'll talk about this on Thursday, is essentially you'll record a video, you'll upload it, the following day your opponent will respond, and then the next day you'll upload a video again. So you're going to be uploading a video once a day for 5 days straight. So you're doing 2 rounds simultaneously. So day 1, everyone uploads this first speech, and then day 2, everyone uploads this speech responding to their opponent. And then day 3, you're going back to your first debate, so you're debating 2 different opponents at the same time, and then responding to this speech. So everyone's uploading the same speech each day, but you have 2 different opponents doing both sides. So you'll do a proposition round and an opposition round. Okay? And then the top half of everyone in all the participating schools that qualify get to qualify for a second week of debates. The way it's graded is you start with a B+. If you just complete all of your debates and lose both debates, you get the B+. For each win you get, it goes up a third of a letter grade. And so since there's a possibility of having 4 rounds, you could get to an A++. That'll just be figured in mathematically for that percentage of your syllabus. Alright, so being competitive, you have a second week of debates, but that second week of debates will increase your grade. So it's a good thing if you get there, even though it's, extra work. Okay? Questions on that, or like the order of the speeches? That's sort of self-explanatory. The thing that's important to notice is that the proposition has the first and the last speech, and the opposition has more time in each of their speeches, right? So if you're a proposition, you get to frame the debate. You get to be the first words in the judge's head and the last words in the judge's head, which is which means that if you're rhetorically powerful, it's really good because you can sort of frame and control the element of the debate. If you're the opposition, you don't have that ability, but what you do have the ability of is more speaking time. And so if you're opposition and you only use half of your speaking time, you're giving up the benefit of your side where you're able to sort of make more arguments. In this form of debate, anything that's not answered in the first available speech is considered conceded. So if, for instance, the proposition makes an argument that eating meat will cause global warming and will destroy the entirety of the planet by 2020 and we'll all go extinct. If the opposition doesn't answer that argument, according to the judge, becomes a truth statement. All right, and so this is why having more time is valuable, because you can make more arguments during that period of time. All right. It also means, though, on the proposition side, you have to think critically about what you want to answer and what you don't want to answer. Just because someone has made an argument doesn't mean it's a good argument, and you could be able to say, even if this is true, so even if I didn't answer the fact that the sky is green, that's irrelevant because it doesn't matter if the sky is green in relation to whether or not it's ethical. If they say, if the proposition says global warming will destroy the world, and the opposition says being vegetarian is a classist act because only certain people have the privileges to be able to eat vegetarian, therefore it's not ethical to always be vegetarian, and that classism is more important than environmental destruction because we should prioritize discrimination, it doesn't matter if I answered that eating meat will destroy the planet, because I'm saying that's irrelevant. What should be put first is impacts of discrimination. So it's sort of weighing impacts. And if you remember from the SPAR debates, a lot of you are doing those things. Sometimes it was like freedom of speech versus like the economic effects of what would happen if music was on the radio, or economic effects of secession or something along those lines, right? So like you're already used to sort of weighing impacts of things and sort of saying what is more important than the other. So just because you don't answer something doesn't mean that you can't explain why what you're saying is more important, but it does mean that you would not be able to answer it in the next available opportunity, or again later on in the debate because you passed up that opportunity. Does that make sense to people? All right. And so while you don't have to use all your speech time, you should always use all your speech time, because the more things that you say or the more details you give, the better your speech is going to be, which is going to make it harder for your opponent to actually answer. And so just like in the SPAR debates, you have to sort of pick what's worth my time answering, what's not worth my time answering, and sort of focusing in on the last two speeches for why you win the debate, and not necessarily everything else. In sports, like say in football, you have a bunch of different players, and in the end, in order to score a touchdown, you just need to have the ball connect from two players. But you don't just have those two players on the field, because what would end up happening is that the other team would be able to stop those two players. So you have other players or other arguments to distract your opponent, but in the end, you only need one argument to win you the debate round. So you utilize your other arguments sort of as like pieces on the chessboard to get your opponent to do certain things or to say certain things, so that way you could direct the debate and respond otherwise. So it's sort of setting up strategic thinking in the way that you construct your arguments. Yeah?
So for the proposition, is it more like a quantity over quality argument to mean that your opposition has to rebuttal everything you say, otherwise they're going to concede that?
I would say that on the proposition side, it's easier to do quality over quantity, because the opposition has more time than you. So if you just make a bunch of arguments and you only have two good ones, you've just wasted your time developing those arguments, whereas the opposition has time to throw out some bad arguments, and if the proposition doesn't deal with it, that means that they can maybe make it seem like it's a good enough argument in the end because it was conceded. And so both would make a variety of arguments. I would say the proposition could come up with maybe 2 or 3 reasons for why the statement should be affirmed, but in the last closing statement, only really be explaining and going for one. And so if you think about like arguing with your friends or your parents or anything like that, normally when you start off asking, to be able to do something, or wanting to go downtown or whatever else, you start with a bunch of different reasons for why you're correct. But as the argument advances further and further, you're not going for all the arguments that you say. You're going for the 1 or 2 ones that you think that makes the most sense to the person you're arguing against, right? So just like in real life, you're sort of narrowing down your initial set of arguments. The next quiz question is, what can't you do in the rebuttals and closing speeches that you could do in the opening speeches? And that is make new arguments. And so what that means is that in your opening speeches, you have to present all of the arguments that you want to use in the debate round. After that point, then what you have to do is interact your arguments with the other team's arguments. So these first 2 speeches, each team sort of presents, here's all the reasons for why I'm for this statement, here's all the reasons why I'm against this statement. And then in the rebuttals, they're interacting those arguments together. So you're sort of making new arguments because you're interacting things, but you're not making new arguments because they're all outgrowth of these other points. Now, what's interesting is that there is not necessarily a bright line between what is a new argument versus just an extension or an extrapolation of an old argument. So if you're sly, you can be like, in my last speech I said this. That means, and then insert something that's entirely different that you want to actually say, but it's close enough where the judge thinks that it's not a new argument. And the judge is ultimately the one who sort of makes the final decision there. So if you're able to do it in a way that people don't notice, or the judge doesn't notice, then you can sort of make or morph your arguments into being something else. But if your opponent is morphing their arguments and making it into something else, you as a debater should point out, this is a new argument, you shouldn't allow that to take place in the debate room. Yeah?
Are we allowed to use any sort of visual aid while recording the video, or is it just us two?
Yes, you could do whatever you want. So, for instance, if you don't want to be on the camera, like you could have, I don't know, you could have videos of factory farms going as your voice is over it, or you could have montage sequences or images or whatever it is that you want to be able to do based upon sort of how technically proficient you are. So you can feel free to play with the medium that you're using, and then also, like, you know, feel free to also play with sort of how you decide to frame yourself with the camera. What do you want to have in back of you? Do you just want to be in like a messy dorm room with the closet door open or something like that? Do you want to be in behind a chalkboard? You know, sort of set up your surroundings, sort of like the level of professionalism that you want. Most judges won't really care if you look incredibly professional. You don't have to get dressed up for that. A lot of people have uploaded their videos on buses and things like that, but some people, you know, make sure that they're set up nicely. They'll go into a classroom, put up a podium here, and sort of record themselves so that way it looks more official and things like that. Some people will have PowerPoints displayed, like either on the screen, or will just like have it projected in the background. It's up to you. And if you're good with video editing, if you make a mistake like 2 minutes and 30 seconds in, you could just record a 30-second chunk and edit those 30 seconds back in there. But I definitely recommend at least re-watching the video that you've recorded before uploading it, and if it's not what you want, either revise the whole thing. I mean, it's only 4 minutes, so it's not like a lot of your life, or, you know, revise the 30 seconds that you need to improve upon. You'll have essentially 24 hours to upload each speech, so that gives you time to sort of, you know, record, re-record, upload, things along those lines. Questions? Okay, so from here, order the speeches, time limits, then what can't you do in the constructive, or what can't you do in the rebuttals and closing that you can do in the constructives? The answer is make new arguments. Alright? Any questions on any of this stuff? No? Okay, so in the first proposition opening speech, there are a couple things that you need to prove. The acronym for it is SHITS. So the quiz question will be, what are the SHITS and what do they stand for? You're expected to be able to say what each one of these letters are and like a sentence definition for what it is. Alright? Inherency is the argument that the belief isn't already in place or exists. And so, essentially, so inherency is that what you're affirming is not already in existence, that you're not just the status quo. So as a proposition, your job is to prove that you are different than the status quo. Currently, most people don't necessarily think vegetarian is a better ethical choice than meat eating because most people are not vegetarian. If they did think that, they would be vegetarian. So it's pretty easy in this regard, so it's not going to be a large portion of your speech, but you would generally say that there is a mindset that prevents people from understanding why this is an ethical choice because the markets don't let you see how food is actually being produced in factory farms because they give you commercials of like happy cows or something like that. So you sort of set up the story by explaining why the status quo looks the way it does. Why is it that people currently don't think it's an ethical choice? And that sort of begins to frame your story. The H stands for harms. What's wrong or bad if we don't vote for the proposition side? So in that case, factory farms are destroying the environment, which has a negative utilitarian cost to the world because of the way that there's runoff and CO2 emissions. The factory farm industry is horribly abusive to a whole bunch of animals, cutting off the beaks of chickens, castrating pigs, and so on and so forth. There's a long list of abuses that they do, and so that could be a deontological reason to vote for the proposition. That is unethical to torture animals just to eat their flesh when there's other options that are just as healthy or healthier available. Right? So there's a bunch of different harms that you could have for if the resolution isn't affirmed. And generally, that's in opposition to inherency. Currently, people don't understand these things because commercials don't show it, or because there's currently a bill called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act that prevents people from filming in factory farms. And so that prevents the knowledge from getting out there. If people don't know or don't make this change, then these bad things will happen. All right. Yeah?
Introduce the definition for
Inherency
inherency.
is the evidence of the argument that what you're affirming doesn't already exist. So, for instance, if you decided to, as a proposition, to say, I affirm that people should make the choice to be vegetarian. Well, people are already making the choice to be vegetarian, so that does not necessarily mean that you're changing the status quo. Whereas to affirm that it is ethically better to be vegetarian, that's not something that people are affirming holistically in continuation. So you have to just prove that you're not the status quo in the inherency. Okay? Yeah?
I'm sorry for backtracking, but I just want to make sure of one thing. So you have the prop opening and the opposition opening. Does that mean because the opening is for introducing arguments that you don't really need to refute the proposition's arguments until the opposition rebuttal? Or should the opposition in their opening start refuting points of the...
Your opening speech as the opposition should have picked arguments that you know will respond to the proposition's argument. So you don't have to do the interactions with it, but for instance, if you're going to make the local farming of animals is good for the environment, like a localitarian type argument, and you're going to use that to answer their environmental scenarios, you'd put that out there, but then in the rebuttal, you'll be like, our arguments about local production of meat are better than the proposition's arguments about factory farm being destructive, and then you do that comparative analysis, so you take it a step further in your next speech, but in your opening speech, you'd lay out the initial arguments you would then use to answer. Yeah?
They're done, and the two openings are done on different days, right?
Yes, this is due Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, right? And so they're due Pacific time. It's on the back of the syllabus, so it's actually like Tuesday at 3 a.m., Wednesday, Thursday, etc., etc. But I strongly recommend you do not wait till the deadline, because it will take you, unless you have a really good internet connection, anywhere from 10 to 20 minutes to upload your YouTube video. Then I promise that if you are doing it last minute, you'll be the person that has the technology error and stuff like that. And there are penalties in the syllabus for late submissions and things like that, because since it's only 24 hours, sometimes people want to watch the video immediately when it gets posted, think about it, go to sleep, wake up, do it the next day. So there's a strategy. So it hurts your competitor when you don't do that. So do it earlier in the day, especially for that first video day, because since you know what this is, and since you're going to have to give that speech and you're not responding to anything, like you could literally plan that out tonight if you wanted to and just start recording it and troubleshoot it. So in that first speech you sort of figure out the system, and you should do that earlier rather than later. Other questions? Okay. So harms is why something's bad. Then you have to prove solvency. And so in regards to solvency, you have to prove essentially that voting for the proposition will do something, that it will solve for the harms. I.e., if we recognize that being vegetarian is a better ethical choice than eating meat, the problems of meat eating will cease. We will be able to affirm a world without the injustices that non-human animals face on a daily basis and things. So you essentially show why voting for you matters, okay? If you're writing a paper, and this is really important, I teach courses where people hand in papers. A lot of people will write a paper on a topic that is interesting, but it does not matter whatsoever because the student doesn't explain why it matters. And papers are essentially an argument. You form a thesis that's an interpretation about something. You should explain why that is beneficial, right? Same thing in debate round is, why would voting for you matter? Are they just voting for you because you happen to speak more pretty? Or are they voting for you because of something that you're trying to get across or convey? And so, as the proposition, you want to show that voting for you will be able to solve the harms that you outline in your speech. Okay? The other S stands for significance. It's basically a dictionary definition of significance. That the issue that you are dealing with is substantial and that you will be able to solve a substantial portion of it. So essentially, you can't say that you affirm that being a vegetarian is ethical at Binghamton University only because because there's a lot of vegan food that's available. That is not necessarily solving for anything substantial or significant because it's localized just to Binghamton University. You could make the argument that it's significant because each person who makes the choice at each college campus has the ability to change the way that food will be provided at other college campuses. So you can make the argument that changing one person's dietary choice is a significant thing, or saving one chicken is a significant thing, but you have to make those arguments to sort of justify why that one chicken, why that one person matters, or you could establish it based upon, right, if factory farms are going to emit so much greenhouse gas that the planet's going to die by 2020, and there's a bunch of evidence of people out there who say that, that means that is obviously a significant impact because that will result in extinction if we don't start making this change. Okay? Make sense to people? Yep. It has to affect to a substantial degree. It has to be significant in scope. And so that could be done on like a numbers way or like a valued way, right? And so there's different ways that you could approach topics. It can be from a deontological sense that just racism is wrong in each and every instance. We should reject racism. In this case, it'd be speciesism. Or you could approach it in a larger sense. Racism might be bad, but the numbers of people dying from insert this war is even worse, and we have to pay attention to a bigger utilitarian body count, right? And so you'd be able to sort of weigh the significance of something either way and have a debate over what is more important, whether, sort of the smaller social justice issues or the larger ramifications that affect everyone. Make sense? Okay. And the T stands for topical. You have to show as a proposition that you affirm the topic, that you say yes to this resolution. So for instance, if you got up there and you said that we should stop wearing leather, that might be good, but that doesn't affirm this statement, right? So that's not topical. That's unfair because, the other side is not prepared to debate it. Does that make sense to people? No. Yeah?
Would the opposition address that in their opening, that basically what you said was not topical, or would they let the judge just basically...
I would say that if someone was debating me and I was the opposition and they got up there saying, well, we should stop wearing leather, I'd be like, that's not fair, that's not what the debate was supposed to be about, my research was directed this way, and I make arguments for why they should lose the round because of that. Now, in debate, you could do essentially whatever it is that you want to do, as long as at the end of the day, you could get the judge to vote for you. So if you want to get up here and start talking about stuff that has nothing to do with this resolution, you could do that. You could get up there and talk about why we shouldn't be debating about this because we should be debating about why debating at all in the U.S. is on stolen land from Native Americans, which means that anything we do is ignoring the genocide that took place here in order to enrich our own college experiences. And the opposition could say, that's not fair. And if you can win that doesn't matter, because the same way that courts have said it's not my jurisdiction to decide on Native issues because it's a state issue or federal issue, if you can win that that's more important than this rule, you can win the debate round. But you need to convince the judge of that argument, right? So most people will affirm the resolution because it's oftentimes hard to convince the judge that you should just disregard it. But you can very readily get a judge to disregard it if you come up with arguments or reasons for why debating about something else is more important. Okay? And so, more like, I'll say fishy, ways of doing it is like you could affirm being a vegetarian and not include fish within that definition of vegetarian, even though it's normally called pescatarian, because certain fishes will be able to solve iron deficiency and things like that. So that will be better for people who are anemic. So you could say you're topical because being vegetarian does not necessarily include fish within that definition and things like that. But you sort of have to show or explain why it is that you affirm the topic. Alright? So the quiz question is, what are the shits and what do they stand for? It's 1 point for being able to write each one of these words, and 1 point for being able to write like a sentence definition of what each one of these words are. Does that make sense to people? Does anybody need me to repeat anything? Yeah.
Go over what fiat is one more time.
Fiat is the belief that if the judge votes affirmative, that the statement goes into effect or is upheld. So
It's like basically giving judge the authority over the argument.
Right.
basically.
Yeah. So sometimes the resolution is policy based, as like the United States federal government should institute like a law to ban meat eating. The belief that the judge votes affirmative in that resolution would be like the law gets signed, you can't argue that something will get filibustered. This is more of a public debate resolution, which is centered more on values, but it means that the opposition can't say people will not accept that it's the ethical choice. If the judge votes for the proposition, the assumption is that it is the ethical choice, and the proposition gets all the effects of that ethical choice being made. Yeah?
These are the guidelines you follow along the proposition side.
These are what you generally prove. These are all the components that you want in that first proposition opening speech.
Okay.
Right? So you want to be able to outline what the status quo is, your inherency, why that is bad, your harms, why affirming the topic, your topical, would be able to solve that problem to a significant extent. Right? So you essentially, you would tell a full story from the status quo to what you're advocating to why that would be good. Okay? Does that make sense to people? And there are plenty of different ways to do that. You could do it through just raw numbers. Like some people might want to, get into the number count of the animals that are slaughtered each year. Or some people might not care about that. Some people might think about the emotional impact of hearing the pig squeal. Or, have something that's more of a narrative based. Or have something that's, some people might really structural. Like I have 4 reasons for why this needs to be affirmed. 1, 2, 3, 4, and actually number it out. Some people might want to talk about it more holistically as a full approach. Different styles will lend itself to different forms of argumentation, and we'll talk about that next week or the following week before we actually get to actually having to upload the speeches. But you can utilize different ways to go about doing that, and so you should play to your strengths. If you're a very good logical thinker, you should be structural in your arguments. If you're a very good, someone who can speak with passion and emotion, you should, utilize those sort of elements of argumentation instead. Yeah?
In the proposition opening, should you take a preemptive strike against the opposition, like what you think they're going to argue? Like I know in our in-class debates, a lot of people are like, I know you're going to bring up freedom of speech.
It's not a bad idea to do that, but you also have your rebuttal to do that. Right? So you don't have to do that. So, I would, in the initial proposition speech, I'd put out the arguments that I'd want to use to answer free speech, but I wouldn't make it explicitly an answer to the other side, right? Because if you say, I know you're going to say free speech, and they weren't smart enough to think about it, now they're like, oh, maybe I'll make the free speech argument now, right? But if you just made the argument that would answer free speech, if they do make it, you could be like, my argument that, right to life has to come before, freedom of choice is already responded to this, then you could get to the next level of argumentation thereafter. Yeah?
During the opposition opening, can you interact with the proposition arguments?
Yeah, I mean, you can. But, again, if all you're doing is answering the proposition's arguments in your initial opposition, you haven't presented a reason for why it should be rejected. Right? And so the goal of the opposition is to show why the proposition should lose the round. And so if all you're doing is well, it won't destroy the environment, it won't do this, it won't do that, you might not have a reason for why they should lose the round, you just have reasons for why it might not be a great idea. Right? And I'm sure you've had arguments with friends and parents where it's like, you want to go downtown, or you want to go to the movies, or you want some money, and they have a bunch of really bad reasons that they don't want to do that action. And nothing is a reason for why we shouldn't do it, but it's like, I don't have enough money, well, I'll pay for you. It's like, well, then, I sort of am a little bit lazy, but what else are you doing? Why not go out and do that, right? There's just a bunch of bad reasons that you have to get past. And so if you're not developing your own arguments, I don't want to go downtown because I have a paper to write. I don't want to go downtown because I want to get the premiere of this movie, right? Then there's no reason not to go ahead and do something. Okay? Any questions on those 5 things? Okay. So, then in the opposition opening speech, there are a couple of ways that you go about answering the proposition. There's what's known as on-case and off-case arguments. On-case arguments is where you respond to the shits directly. Factory farms don't destroy the environment. Animals are not being tortured. you won't be able to solve. People already believe it's the ethical choice. Essentially, they say yes, you say no. Right? You're responding immediately to the affirmative case. Off-case arguments are more of a tangent away from that proposition's arguments, but are still related. So, there are 4 different types of off-case arguments. Quiz question is, what are the 4 different types of off-case arguments? The first off-case argument is known as a disadvantage, or a disad, or a DA for short. And what disadvantage is a linear chain of events set in motion by the affirmative that causes something bad to happen. So A causes B, causes C, and that's bad. So a linear chain of events set in motion by the affirmative plan that causes something bad to happen. Okay? So an example of a disadvantage here would be that if people make the ethical choice to go vegetarian, the factory farm industry, which is a huge percentage of the GDP, would go bankrupt overnight, which will devastate the economy. If the economy gets hurt, it will cause a recession and a depression, which will cause countries generally go to war as a way to revitalize their economy. Or, in addition, if economic decline happens, people start, not caring about helping others or not caring about the treatment of animals. So if the economy goes down and is destroyed as a result of people making this ethical choice, that would be a bad thing because of what happens as a result of that taking place. Does that make sense to people? A causes B, causes C. C is a bad thing. Okay? Now, in the disadvantage, there's a couple of things that you need to prove. And you're supposed to be able to list the steps within the disadvantage. The first thing you have to prove is uniqueness. Why the problem isn't already happening now. So, your first argument would be, currently, people are not making the switch to vegetarianism. The factory farm industry is doing well. They're making money. So it's unique. It's not something that's going to happen anyhow. Then you have a link. How the affirmative causes it. If people make the choice to stop eating meat, then the money that the factory farm industry is bringing in will be destroyed, which will tank the economy.
Can you repeat that first sentence?
For link, or the
Yeah, for what?
link is what the affirmative does that causes it. So if people stop making the ethical choice, start making the choice to eat meat, if they start making the choice to be vegetarian, then it will hurt the factory farm's abilities to generate profit. Oftentimes there's an internal link. Factory farm profits going down will hurt the entirety of the U.S. economy. And then impact. When the U.S. economy goes down, they bomb other countries to try and get it to go up, so it causes war. Alright, so now you've made an argument that if people make the ethical choice to go vegetarian, it will cause war because it will destroy the U.S. economy because it hurts the factory farm industry, and that war is worse than the choice that takes place. Does that make sense to people? So it's a disadvantage, something bad that's caused that is not directly related to the affirmative plan, but is sort of a tangent to it. Right? And now, it might be bad that some animals are getting tortured, but if we're going to have World War III because of the destruction of the economy, that might be worse than making an ethical choice. You can then weigh the utilitarian impact of the wars that would happen from hurting the economy with the result of, with the ethical reasons for why the proposition says to go. Right? And so that means that you don't have to win, per se, that it is unethical to be vegetarian. You have to win that the choice that it is ethical is not necessarily always a good thing. So you could be like, we could agree it might be an ethical choice, but you should lose the debate round because affirming that statement, the effect of affirming that statement will mean it'll destroy the economy, which could kill us all. And how can we be ethical for all that? And so, sort of what was happening in some of the SPAR debates is that you don't necessarily have to answer the direct argument they're making if you can make another argument that's more important. Okay, and so the logic of the disadvantage is that even if there might be only like a 1 or 2% risk of you causing this disadvantage, because the impact is the end of the world or a large war, it's not worth that risk. Okay? Another disadvantage, for example, could be family farmers. Family farms are a little bit on the increase right now because people don't really like factory farm meat. Even meat eaters don't really like it a whole lot because it is really nasty and destructive to the environment and stuff like that. So some people are choosing to eat local now. So family farms are slowly beginning to get some profit again. But if we affirm that statement, the family farmers will lose a little bit of traction that they've gotten, and that will destroy family farms. Family farms would be the only way that we can have healthy local food that is available, which leaves only the major corporations like Monsanto to provide us genetically modified food, which will also destroy the environment, right? So now I have a family farmer just said that advocating for this ethical choice will shift the industry back to only being the big agro-businesses for fruits and veggies like Monsanto, opposed to local small-scale farmers, which are beginning to finally get profits back because they're finally being able to compete because people are willing to pay that extra dollar for the local, more humane raised meat, right? So again, not really responsive to it because I'm not taking a stance on whether it's ethical or not. I'm taking a stance that if we affirm that it is ethical and people make that choice, then it'll hurt the family farmers, which are more important because of the way that intersects with the food environment. And so the uniqueness is family farmers are increasing now. Link is you will destroy family farms because you will take away their profits. Internal link would be that if family farmers lose their profits, the big agribusinesses take control. And the impact is Monsanto and big agribusinesses are really bad for the environment, for health, or for any of the number of other reasons for why they do that. Okay, and then what you've done is you've shifted the debate away from the ethics of eating meat to the ethics of big agribusinesses like Monsanto. Right, so you've been able to shift the ground away from what the proposition probably wants to talk about to ground that you might be more comfortable debating about. People good? Any questions? Quiz question is going to be, what are the 4 types of off-case arguments? And so here, one of them is a disadvantage, and you should be able to define that as A causes B causes C and that's bad, or a linear chain of events that causes something that's bad. The affirmative results in a negative consequence that is not immediately the cause of it. Any of those are a definition. And then another quiz question will be, what are the steps that you have to prove within a disadvantage? And you don't have to define them, you just have to be able to link uniqueness, link internal link impact.
First question was disadvantage.
First question is, what are the 4 types, what are the 4 things you need to prove within a disadvantage?
Okay.
And then the larger quiz question are, what are the 4 types of off-case arguments? Disadvantage is the first.
Okay.
So I'm going to tell you the other 3 in a second. Other questions? Okay. So the next type of off-case argument is known as a counterplan, or CP. And a counterplan is where instead of affirming the resolution, you affirm something else. Okay? And so what that means is, so an example of a counterplan could be that instead of this house believes that being a vegetarian is a better ethical choice than eating meat, it could be this house believes that eating only local meat is a better ethical choice than being an omnivore in all situations. Or this house believes that it is better being a vegetarian is a better ethical choice only when it's from factory farms, not when it's from local producers, than meat eating. Right? So you essentially would affirm something that is not that resolution. Okay? So it's another idea. So that way you don't have to, as the opposition, just say, no, I disagree, but you can actually advocate for something else instead. Right? You could advocate for, they're making meat in petri dishes now, so that way it's not coming from animals, so that way it's not using factory farms. Like, the technology is not right there yet, but you could affirm that instead of saying that being a vegetarian is a more ethical choice than meat eating, it's only more ethical than animal-raised meat eating, but petri dish-raised meat eating would be fine. And so you would be able to sort of carve out exceptions with your counterplan. Okay? Generally, you'd also structure your counterplan to solve your disadvantage. So if you're running disadvantage that says you're going to kill small farmers, you should run like a localitarian counterplan where you say we should only eat meat when locally provided from small farmers. Right? So that way, not only do you stop the small farmers from losing the money that they get from people going vegetarian, you'd actually increase the money that they get because people will be eating more local meat now. Right, so you run a counterplan that sort of couples well with your disadvantage. Okay? And you can think of a bunch of things, because since the proposition has to say vegetarian is an ethical choice, and ethics are supposed to be sort of more universal, that means any non-universal application of vegetarianism is potentially something that you could go for on the opposition side. So you don't just have to be like meat eating is good, you could advocate meat eating in food deserts when there's no other available options. You can advocate indigenous styles of meat eating, hunter-gatherer principles and things like that. So you don't have to have just a yes-no debate. You could pick something smaller and more nuanced that you want to debate about. You could have the yes-no debate. If you just want to have meat is healthier, it's good, it's fine for the environment, factory farms are beneficial because they're efficient, you could have that debate as well. But counterplans are ways that you can step out of that debate so that way you don't have to necessarily take the exact opposite stance. Yeah?
So it's saying that like this hospital is not a vegetarian, it's a better ethical choice than eating meat, like under certain circumstances, that would be like a counterplan or
Yeah.
okay.
I would specify what circumstances
Yeah,
there are. Yeah, but yes, that would be a counterclaim because the proposition is responsible for affirming that statement and not a subset of it. Okay. Now, with a counterclaim, you have to prove a couple of things as well, or you need to have a couple of things. The first thing you have to prove, or you have to do, is you have to have a text. What it is that your counterclaim does, right? The exceptions for when it's okay to eat meat. That would be your text of the counterclaim. So just like the proposition would say, we believe that, or this house believes that, and they would say the resolution. If you are on the opposition side, you would say, we believe, and insert what it is that you want to believe or what the judge would be voting for your actions. The next thing you need is why it's mutually exclusive. And that means that they can't be done at the same time. Okay? So you can't have a universal stance against meat eating and say it's okay to eat local meat simultaneously. Those two things don't work at the same time, right? If all I said, if the negative counterclaim was just factory farm meat is unethical, well, that's not mutually exclusive because all meat, getting rid of all meat is being unethical includes factory farm meat is unethical. So you have to sort of, within your counterclaim, have something that can't be done simultaneously. Okay? You want to go out and get something to eat. I want to go to the movies. We could get something to eat on the way to the movies. That means we could do them together. So what you want doesn't trade off with what I want. We could do them simultaneously. So your counterplan has to be a reason for why the proposition is a bad idea, and that's because it functions as an opportunity cost. The judge has this option or that option. If the proposition could be proved, could show that they could be done together, is not a reason to reject them. That stops people from getting up there and having counterplans saying that feeding the hungry is more ethical. That might be true, but it doesn't mean that we can't go vegetarian and feed the hungry, right? So that's not a reason to reject the affirmative or the proposition. So you need to show that they can't be done simultaneously. And the last thing that you have to prove is the net benefit. Why is the counterplan better than the proposition's plan? So you just have to prove that your choice is better than the other person's choice. Alright? What you're doing, why they can't be done together, that your option is better. Okay, those are the three things that you need in a counterplan in order to sort of like explain why you should win around because of it. Yeah?
What are you doing?
What?
Texas, what are you doing?
Yeah. What are you doing? Like what it is that you propose that is the opportunity cost of the proposition. Any questions on counterplans? So the second type of off-case argument, you would be expected to on the quiz say counterplan and say the sentence definition of what a counterplan is, plan that runs in opposition to the affirmative, anything like that, and then be able to list those three steps. Okay? There'll be an extra credit question on, there are two different ways that you could prove something mutually exclusive with one another. The first is on a textual level. Literally, they can't be done at the same time. So literally, you cannot be against all meat eating universally and then make an exception to eat meat locally. That's just like you can't do those things simultaneously. Impossible. The other thing is functional. And so what functional competition is that while it's theoretically possible to do it at the same time, it's not desirable to do it at the same time. Alright? And so, for instance, the local farmers counterclaim. The proposition could say, we should just support local farmers for only fruits and vegetables and not animals. So we can do it at the same time. We can support local farmers and have a universal stance against meat eating. But the person running the counterclaim say that's not functionally competitive because local farmers need the money revenue from chickens and cows because it's easier for them to produce that to get a bigger profit than just selling their fruits and veggies. Which means that even if they theoretically help local farmers and stop eating meat, it's not desirable to do those because it still won't be able to help local farmers enough. So it's theoretically possible, but functionally would not be desirable. Whereas textual just means you literally can't do the two things together. Okay, those are extra credit questions for you to be able to define sort of the two different types of ways to prove it's mutually exclusive. Yeah?
So the functional counterclaim has to be like significant. Like I was thinking of the movies and dinner, and you could be like, well, I don't want to eat dinner and watch a movie at the same time because I want to have my undivided attention towards the movie and I don't want to be focused on eating dinner. But would that be like, we'll just suck it up and just eat dinner at the same time? It's not
If you could prove that's a large enough net benefit. I can't hear when I chew because I'm a loud chewer means that I can't pay attention to the movie. Or if we're going to the movie theater, stopping to get food on the way means we're getting fast food and that's unhealthy and it's undesirable. I'd rather eat at home and eat healthier. So it all depends on, yes, you need to prove that it's a good enough reason, but if you still help the benefits of it, right? If the only reason why they say eating meat is bad is because of factory farms, and you stop factory farms, even if it's only a little bit functionally competitive, but still why not? Because you solve the only reason why they say we should stop eating meat, which is to stop factory farms. You stop factory farms by supporting local farmers, so it doesn't matter. Alright. Okay. So then, the next type of off-case argument is called a critique, or just a K for short. I spell it the K way because I just learned critiques from German spelling first. And plus you can abbreviate it as a K, so it's quicker. A critique is sort of an ideological criticism of the proposition. Something for what they did that was problematic either on a discursive, a methodological, an ontological, an ideological level. So, for instance, if someone kept saying, you know, my opponent, he said this, and then he said this, and then he said that, but you're not a he and you happen to be a she, you could run a critique on the discourse of using he as a universal pronoun because that suddenly makes everyone male, and there's a lot of literature that explains using he as a universal pronoun is problematic because it recreates sexism because it assumes that men are the universal category. Now, if you remember the concept of fiat, the assumption that if the judge votes affirmative that it actually has happened, critiques oftentimes take place at what's known as a pre-fiat level. What's happening in the room itself, or in this case the virtual space itself. So if somebody is using language that is sexist, even if voting against them is only like a 0.0001% chance that it's going to do anything, it's still actually doing something, versus if someone just says, yes, I think it's ethical to not eat meat, that's not actually going to do anything. It's just a debate around the judges. In reality, right, despite what I told you about fiat, you all know that it's not going to actually come true when the judge votes for you if your proposition. Whereas if they vote against someone on a critique because they've done something that's performatively problematic, they use sexist, racist, homophobic language. Like if they said, oh, your arguments are so gay, and you ran a discursive critique saying that you shouldn't use the word gay because it's heterosexist, that's a reason for why they should lose the debate round. And if they go back and they tell one of their friends, they're like, I can't believe I lost this debate round just because I said the word he and they said I shouldn't say this word, right? Suddenly some education actually took place about whether or not that word should be used, which means that even if it's only like a small, like 0.0001% chance of doing something, it actually provided some education over that issue in the real world opposed to in the imaginary world of what happens post-fiat. And so critiques oftentimes deal with isms based upon assumptions that teams make, opposed to the consequences of something being affirmed. And so one of the critiques that that is used a lot against vegan and animal rights activists is criticism of privilege. A lot of animal rights activists are very privileged. They have the money. They come from the social location where they're able to get access to, fake meats, tofu. Don't live in soy desert. Don't live in food deserts. So even though like beans and rice is very nutritious and very cheap, not everyone lives in an area where they can get to a grocery store that has beans and rice. In Binghamton alone, there's like 17 food deserts where where in more than a mile radius there is no bus lines that will get people to an area that has food. And if you are working 2 jobs, or if you are unemployed with a bunch of kids, your ability to travel that distance, buy groceries, and bring it back is not as easy as someone who doesn't live in these sort of food deserts. And so there's a bunch of privilege that goes into the assumption that ethically we should just all be vegetarian, and regardless of those individual social circumstances, right, ignore sort of the class and the race and all the other sort of elements that go into who has the privilege to make these dietary choices. And so in the blackboard, under the opposition literature, there is a book on exactly that question, sort of how the animal rights movement is, coded over with whiteness and class privilege that is oftentimes not addressed within the movement itself. And so that's an example of a critique that would come either from a race or class-based perspective from who's able to have access to making these choices. And again, since ethical is supposed to mean sort of more universal, the proposition has to sort of defend the universality of it and not necessarily the exceptions. Of course, if you are proposition, you could define ethical meaning something else than universal, and there could be a debate over that as well. Okay, so critique is sort of a criticism of the assumptions that go into making up the affirmative. Why is it, that it's racist, sexist, homophobic, etc. All right. In a critique as well, you have a link. What they did that was racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever. So you sort of explain what they did that was problematic in that action. Okay? Then impact. Why is that bad? Well, when animal rights people don't question their privilege and act in racist ways, they go into communities of color or poor communities and just assert a sort of viewpoint upon them that's not receptive and gets people to actually backlash and not think that they want to go vegetarian or not think that they want to eat in healthier ways because they feel that they're just having this pushed upon them by some rich white folk. And so that means that the impact of the critique is not only that it is racist and classist, but that it actually stops people from going vegetarian because of the backlash that's created, right? Like I'm sure you've all heard, people like to hate on PETA all the time and say, oh, PETA just makes me want to just go eat more meat, because PETA has tactics that oftentimes don't pay attention to race, class, sex, sexuality issues and things like that, because they use shock and awe tactics a lot. And so the impact to using those critiques is that sometimes it doesn't transmit well, and there's backlash that happens against PETA that causes people to do the opposite of what PETA would like to have happen. Alright, so the impact is not only that it was racist and classist, but that it also means that it's impossible to solve for the problems that you want to have. And then, you normally have an alternative. As the last thing, is that sort of like a counterplan, what do you propose doing to solve for these issues of privilege? And so for instance, the alternative opposition you have is, my alternative is to reject the proposition, to reject instances of class privilege. That form of awareness will be able to cause a more progressive vegetarian community. In the literature that I included on the blackboard, there's the book by Breeze Harper. She says that a focus on nutritional politics about what communities need and not talking about the animals at all is the best way to go about solving for animal abuse and the problems within the meat industry, because it puts it in ways that humans are more receptive to caring about, because they understand why it's in their community's interest nutritionally, not for these other issues for why most propositions would say. So the alternative in that instance is that the focus should be on nutrition and not on animal liberation. Alright, so it's just, what do you propose should be the focus? If they say something, if they just use racist slurs, your alternative would be like, reject them. Every time someone says something racist in a classroom setting or in an academic setting, they should be rejected until that no longer exists in academic spaces, because it makes it unsafe for people to participate. Or if they were using homophobic slurs and stuff like that. Reject is a perfect alternative, because it means stop, just tell the judge. You have to tell this person, no, this is unacceptable in this space. Okay? It's critique. Yeah.
So we'll be interacting with the judge throughout the debate.
Yes.
The judge can talk to us.
Well, no. The judge will watch your videos, but you should be talking to the judge. You should be telling the judge, you should vote for me because. You should vote against them because. Right? What does that ballot do for the round? Why does it solve? Why does it matter? Why should they vote for you over the other team? And it might be because the other team is homophobic in the language they use because it keeps saying your arguments are gay, or it might be because that the arguments that they're using is upholding a specious bias that is causing ongoing animals to be slaughtered and tortured on a consistent basis just so people could eat. So whatever it is, you just sort of connect with the judge and be like, this is the biggest impact or the biggest harm in the round, and this is why you'll vote for me. Okay. The last type of off-case argument is a procedural. And a procedural argument is essentially where you make up a rule and say that it should be enforced. So, if the proposition said that they believe vegetarian is a better ethical choice except in the case of fish, you could run a procedural argument saying you have to be against eating fish as well, because being a vegetarian means you don't eat fish because fish are an animal, not a plant. If they don't say that they affirm this statement at all, you could say that that's unfair. If they say that we should give the land back to Native Americans, you could say that's unfair. But essentially you make a procedural argument for what they've done that's wrong. If the proposition goes over by 45 seconds, you can make a procedural argument saying they should lose because they went over 45 seconds in timing. If they talk too fast and you can't hear them, you can make a procedural argument saying that they should lose because they talk too fast. Essentially, you can make a procedural argument that says the other side should lose for whatever reason you want, as long as you explain it as a reason for why they should lose. So, in a procedural argument, you have an interpretation where you say what the rule should look like. So, I might actually define what the word ethical means to show that ethical means universal, right? So, if they said that being vegetarian is a more ethical choice only in certain instances, I would say my interpretation is that ethical means you have to be universally in favor of something. They aren't doing that, right? So I'd read a definition, I'd find some author, some literature, either a dictionary or a philosopher that explains the difference between ethics and morals that would show that ethical means universal. Then I would have a violation. They don't do that thing that I said that should be the rule. They aren't universal, right? Or my interpretation is you should adhere to the time limits that I was forced to memorize to take the quiz. Violation, their first speech went 45 seconds over the amount of time that it was going to take. Okay? The rule, they broke the rule, right? If they didn't break the rule, it's not a reason to reject it. Then you have standards. Why your rule is a good rule. If you allow people to go 45 seconds over, that's unfair because it gives them more time to debate. That hurts the fairness of the debate round. If they go over and I have to go over to respond, sooner or later we're just going to be starting to put speeches that are 4 or 5 hours, and that takes up too much time, which will hurt the ability for us to focus on our other classes. If they go over too long, any number of reasons for why going over too long would be bad. Or if you're doing the ethics has to be universal, reasons for why that's a fair debate. It's important that the proposition has to defend universal ethics, because if not, the opposition really can't defend anything, because you could just say we shouldn't eat meat in a specific instance that we shouldn't eat meat in, versus having to defend something larger, so that's not fair. Because ideally the resolution should be constructed with fair ground, which is why the proposition has to take on a more universal sense than just sort of like on occasion. And then lastly, the voting issues. Why is this worth rejecting the other team because? So, it's worth rejecting them because since they already uploaded their speech, it's too late for them to go back and remove 45 seconds of it, which means the damage is already done, so I already have to go longer, or I have to not go as long and they automatically get 45 seconds of advantage on me. Right? So just going longer doesn't make up for it. Alright? So you essentially say why they should lose the round because of it versus something else. So like if I was playing Monopoly with my 6-year-old and she took an extra $1,000 from the bank. That would violate my rule because she starts with $1,000 more. But it might not be worth causing her to lose that game because that just might make it fair because I'm a better Monopoly player than her. Right? So essentially the voting issue is where you prove that it's worth that they should lose as a result of having broken the rule, opposed to just sort of being like, FYI, you cheated, but whatever. Right? You have to convince the judge that that instance of cheating was bad enough that they should lose the round despite everything else that took place. Yeah?
In this example, when talking about the fact that someone went over, wouldn't that be wasting your own time? Would that be looked more favorably upon using the time to argue for whatever you're arguing?
Maybe, but if they went 45 seconds over, are you going to go 45 seconds over, or are you just going to have 45 seconds less to speak? Because if you just take 45 seconds less to speak and you abide by the rules and they consistently go 45 seconds over, they've just gotten consistently more time than you. Right, which definitely puts you at a competitive disadvantage. But maybe their 45 seconds didn't matter because they didn't make a single good argument, so you don't need that extra time either. Right? But people do win arguments. People have won rounds on people going over by even 2 seconds before. Just because they were good at explaining why time limits should be firm and should be set, and as soon as you allow any flexibility, it just creates a slippery slope for everyone, going downhill. And the other person was just like, whatever, I'm sorry, and didn't really answer the argument. And anything that's conceded is truth, which means that they conceded that what they did created a slippery slope where everyone will be giving like 5-hour-long speeches, and that would be a bad format for the debate, and so they lost that what they did was bad for the activity. And generally, the time violation procedurals are more likely to get a judge to vote against someone the bigger it is. It's hard to get someone to be on like a 2-second thing, but if they're like 45 seconds or a minute over, a lot of judges are going to be like, yeah, that broke the rules. There was a time limit. You didn't follow that time limit. So, and because it's a digital format, it's not like the judge could just stop them at that certain time marker. Some judges also might say, I will only pay attention up to the time where it was supposed to stop and not listen to that extra 45 seconds. And you could also ask the judge for that. So instead of it being a reason to vote against the team, the implication could be, don't listen to the last 45 seconds of their speech. Okay? So, the quiz questions here are, what are the 4 different types of off-case arguments? Counterpoint, dissent, critique, procedural. You should be able to give a sentence definition for each one of them. And then the quiz randomly sort of asks, what are the parts within a dissent? What are the parts within the critique? What are the parts within a procedural? So like 2 or 3 of them, you'll have to know the, not be able to define the words, but just be able to write link, impact, alternative. Okay? Yeah?
So like, as in opposition, can you like start with like a procedural argument? Like let's say like they went over like a minute. You can say like, oh, this is unfair, yada yada, and then like after you finish that argument, you still have like 2 minutes left. Can you then like start with like a disadvantage argument?
Yes, definitely, yeah. And so generally the opposition will run a couple of off-case arguments, have a little bit of diversity. Remember, you want to have different players on the field, different pieces in order to win the debate. And then in the end, only go for one. So you might, in your first 4-minute speech, spend a minute talking about the time violation, 2 minutes talking about a critique of privilege, and then another minute talking about why meat is healthy or something like that. And then if they spend a lot of time in their next speech answering that time procedural argument, you could be like, okay, fine, they shouldn't lose the round because they went over. They'll just lose the round in this other argument now, right? And so then, if they spent 2 minutes answering your 1-minute argument, you've then made up that 45-second time trade-off. Right, and so then you don't have to argue for it at the end. So generally, in your last conclusion, in your closing speech, you're going for one major reason for why you win the round, and your opening speech, you sort of create a diversity of arguments for that you could go for. All right, and strategically, when you start a round, you should have an idea of what you want to go for, the argument that you want to win the round on. That's your best argument. But then also have backups in your head. Be like, if they screw up on this other argument, I can also explain why this wins me the round, right? Have audibles, other strategies. Okay? Any questions? Yeah?
If there are no procedural issues that you pick up on, do you have to even mention that?
No. Yeah, you don't have to use any of these 4 different off-case arguments if you don't want. Like, if you don't like isms and you just want to talk about disads, you can just do a disad and counterpoint. If you don't care about like economic effects and you want to talk about privilege, you could just do a critique, right? So it's like whatever it is that you want to do, you could do any combination of them. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
You should separate, like you're not going to do an on-case argument and an off-case argument. You should do either or.
you could do both. You could be like, they say it's bad for the environment. It's not. Here are 2 reasons for why it's not bad for the environment. They say it tortures animals. Actually, the torture is on the decline now. And now I'm going to present my critique. It says blah, 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 blah. And I also have a disadvantage, which is blah, blah, blah. And so in debate, there's offense and there's defense. Defense is why something might not be right. Offense is why they are wrong and they should lose because of it. Right? So it's like, I don't want to go downtown because I'm lazy. It's a defensive argument because I'm lazy, I'm just going to lay on the couch, why not go downtown? Offense would be, every time I go downtown I get drunk and get arrested, I don't want to go downtown. That's a reason for why I should not go downtown, right? And so you generally pair up offense and defense. Reasons for why the other team is just not good, but then offense for why they should be rejected or why you should be voted for. And so you're doing a combination of those things. And generally your off-case arguments are your offense because they are the reasons for why they should lose, and your on-case arguments are more just like, it's not as bad as you say it is. You're not going to be able to solve as much as you thought, so on and so forth. So it's generally more defensive. But debate is a lot about probability times magnitude. How big is the impact, and what's the probability of it coming true? And so you're never going to necessarily win 100% of both. So it's about sort of working with those 2 variables. It's like, how much can I decrease the probability of the environmental destruction from factory farms plus the economic disadvantage that I have in terms of why they should lose. Alright. Any other questions? Okay. So that's pretty much everything that will be on the quiz for next week. On Thursday, if people have questions and want refreshers on any of these sort of stuff, there'll be time for people to just sort of give questions and things like that. And then on Thursday, you'll also sort of see the online platform and how to sort of navigate and utilize that and everything. Okay? So, that's everything.